Hello everybody, this is Prof. Graham again with the third and final lecture in the theme Mass Media and Political Communication. In the other two online lectures, we covered mass media and political communication as an introduction. We looked at the theories of the mass media. There are 4. These might feature very prominently in the exam coming up in May or June. And we looked at how the media can promote democracy in 4 key ways, through fostering public debate, acting as a watchdog, redistributing power and political influence, and being the vehicle through which democracy can operate. And we ended off there with media's democratic potential. Now we're going to cover the section on the mass media and governance. This is on page 238, 239, and 240 onwards in your Hayward 3rd edition. What we're aware of is that the media has certainly affected the processes of governance in 3 key ways. Firstly, through the transformation of political leadership, through changes to political culture, and through alterations to the behavior of government. The chief way in which the mass media has transformed political leadership is through growing interest in the personal lives and private conduct of senior political figures at the expense of serious and sober policy and ideological debate. This stems in part from the media, in particular TV's, obsession with image rather than issues, and with personalities rather than with politics itself or with policies. In the UK, for example, and other parliamentary type systems, it's evident there's a tendency towards the Americanization of politics. Such trends reflect not so much conscious bias on the part of the media as an attempt to sell politics to a mass audience that is deemed to be little interested in issues and policies, but it accounts for their tendency to treat elections, for example, as horse races or as beauty contests, and the focus is always on who is supposed to win, who is going to win. These tendencies invariably coincide, turning these elections into beauty contests between leading politicians, each of whom serves as the brand image of their party. Leaders are basically judged on the basis of their televisual skills. In other words, whether or not they appear on TV to be relaxed, if they have a sense of humor, if they have the ability to demonstrate the popular touch. In other words, do they dance on stage? Do they relate to the people? Rather than focusing on whether or not they can master political issues and whether or not they have any real capacity for serious debate. So there can be really little doubt over the years that the advent of the media age, which is what we're living in, has changed the behavior of political leaders as well as affected the career prospects of individual politicians. Personal appearance, for example, style of dress and so on have become more important in determining political preferment or advancement than anything else. More importantly, apart from simply changing the face of modern politics, what these have done is reordered power relationships both within the political executive and between the executive and the assembly. The basically growth of political celebrity politics in other words, gives presidents, prime ministers and other party leaders the ability to make very personal appeals to the voters, creating this phenomenon of what we call spatial leadership, which is basically the tendency of political leaders to distance themselves from their own parties and governments by presenting themselves as kind of outsiders or developing their own political stance or ideological position on something. This basically allows leaders to appeal over the heads of their senior colleagues, parties and government institutions directly to the public. Furthermore, the messages they give and the policy and ideological stances they adopt are increasingly determined by leading politicians personally, supported, it appears, by an ever-expanding band of public relations consultants, media managers and publicity directors. One of the consequences of this is that junior politicians may have an additional reason for deferring to their leaders. their fear of damaging their leader's image and reputation. Because if the leader is damaged, especially by splits and internal criticism by their own party members, all members of his or her party then suffer. There's a very interesting website, if you want to go see, talking about handsome politicians on TV and which politicians around the world are deemed to be the most handsome. It's an interesting website, and basically it helps to reinforce this idea that public image is more important than actual policy issues. How people look seems to be more important than what they're actually saying in politics. The second way in which the media has affected governance is through its impact on political culture. The media is sometimes charged with having created a climate of corrosive criticism amongst the public, leading to growing popular disenchantment with politics generally, and a lack of trust in governments and politicians of all complexions. This may, in turn, be linked to trends that have afflicted maturer democracies, in particular, for example, in the UK, where you've seen declining voter turnout and falling party membership. The UK, in particular, has advanced this example of a media-driven culture of contempt. But similar tendencies are also evident elsewhere in, for example, Canada, Australia, and the USA. But why do you think this has happened? Well, a critical stance towards politicians in general and governments in particular is vital to the maintenance of democratic governance. Remember, we discussed this under democracy. However, the distinction between legitimate criticism and systematic and relentless negativity may, in practice, be difficult to uphold. The media, after all, is a business, and this places inevitable pressure on the coverage of news and current affairs. Facts are absorbed more and more quickly into a swirl of contempt and interpretation, blurring seemingly altogether the distinction between what happens and what it means. Similarly, routine political debate and policy analysis receive less and less attention as the media focuses instead on, or hypes on, scandals of various kinds and allegations of incompetence. You see here point number 3 on the slide. They also might focus on policy failure or simply inertia. Leading politicians have, as a result, come to live in a kind of ongoing reality television program whose sole purpose appears to be to embarrass and denigrate them at every possible turn. And in turn, the public view the politicians as untrustworthy and deceitful. The final way in which the mass media has influenced government is through its impact on the policy-making process itself. This has happened in at least 2 ways. The first is that, just like everyone else in society, government is bombarded by a much greater quantity of information arriving almost immediately. Knowing too much can sometimes be as dangerous as knowing too little about a subject. Think about 2001, the 11th of September, or otherwise referred to as 9/11, with the terrorist attacks in America and Pennsylvania. The problem the US faced there was not that it lacked information about Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was the terrorist organization that was blamed for those attacks in America in 2001. It wasn't that America lacked info about Al-Qaeda or its plans and movements. It's just that the sheer quantity of national security intelligence available made effective analysis almost impossible. Moreover, as news and information spreads around the globe at a faster pace, governments are forced to react to events more quickly, and often before they've even fully discussed and digested these events. So what you have is this age of 24/7 government. An age of 24/7 news becomes one of 24/7 government because politicians are encouraged or even forced to take a stance on issues simply to avoid being criticized for inaction. And because of this, it leaves them little time for the analysis of policy options and their implications. The second reason is that there seems to be a greater reliance on the mass media, and as a result it means that it's often the media and not government that sets the political agenda and dictates the direction of policy making. For example, the fact that television pictures of the Asian tsunami in December 2004 were broadcast almost immediately across the globe created this outpouring of public sympathy for the victims of the tsunami, and it led to unprecedented levels of private charitable donations, forced governments around the world within days to substantially increase their scale of aid and support. If we look at new media and the rise of e-politics, we can't ignore the fact that through various communication revolutions over the years, we are definitely living in an information society or a network society. We're always on some kind of network, whether it's an internet network or a mobile network or a TV network or some kind of network. And it's an important thing to recognize that internet penetration is growing. In 2000, for example, 1 in 17 people globally had access to the internet. In 2012, not that long after 2000, 1 in 3 people had access to the internet globally. In 2016, for example, Japan's almost all of its population, 91%, used the internet compared to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where only 4% of the population use the internet. So if you have a look at this website, you can see the internet live stats, how many internet users you have per country. It's an interesting statistic and almost always reflects the current idea that you have developing countries with less access to the internet versus developed countries with greater access to the internet. And in this new media and rise of e-politics, you have keywords like e-democracy, online voting, online petitions, e-campaigning, social media, which is used to organize protests. Look at the Arab Spring and how that occurred from previous lectures. And new media is changing politics in 3 ways, because firstly, it's altering the conduct of elections. The fact that Obama spent most of his time in 2008 using e-campaigning, as opposed to previous years when it's all physical campaigning, on-the-road campaigning. Secondly, there's easier access to government through e-government, which makes government basically more available and accessible to the public online. And thirdly, it has helped to support the development of political social movements. You can have a look on page 187 to 189 in Hayward. We also need to consider media globalization. An aspect of the media's influence that has attracted growing political attention is its role in strengthening globalization. Radio and television started this process as it became increasingly difficult to insulate the populations of one country from news, info, and images broadcast from other countries. Consider this. An example was the extent to which the communist regimes of Eastern Europe were destabilized by the growing penetration of pro-Western and pro-capitalist radio and television broadcasts from Western Europe and the USA, which helped to contribute to the revolutions in Eastern Europe from 1989 to 1991. This new media, and especially satellite television, mobile phones, and the internet, have dramatically intensified this process, both because of their dramatic spread and because of their inherently transnational characters. China and Singapore are amongst the few countries still trying to censor the internet, with such attempts likely to become less and less accessible over time. Insofar as the mass media facilitates or even fuels globalization, it has contributed to a far-reaching range of political developments, including the growth of a globalized capitalist economy, the declining or at least changing role of the state, and the emergence of what some people see as a homogenized global culture. The role of the mass media in promoting cultural globalization has been an area of particular controversy. The power of the mass media, allied to the growth of transnational corporations and mass tourism, is often held to be responsible for the development of a single global system that imprints itself on all parts of the world. This results in a kind of global monoculture. The most prominent feature of this process has been the worldwide advance of consumerism and of the materialistic values and appetites that underpin global capitalism. Benjamin Barber dubbed this emerging world McWorld. So here you see McWorld, Benjamin Barber. He said the McWorld to capture the idea that mass communications and modern commerce tied together by technology had created a world in which people everywhere are mesmerized by fast music, fast computers, fast food, with MTV, Macintosh, and McDonald's pressing nations into one commercially homogeneous theme park. In this view of cultural globalization, the rich diversity of global cultures, religions, traditions, and lifestyles is being subverted by a process of westernization or Americanization made possible by what people have called media imperialism. The Western, or more specifically American culture of cultural globalization stems not only from the fact that the West is the home of consumer capitalism, but also from the tendency of global media content to derive disproportionately from the West, and particularly from the USA. This is reflected in the rise of English as the global language and in the global dominance of Hollywood films and US-produced television programs. However, this image of cultural homogenization fueled by the global mass media fails to capture what is in practice a complex and often contradictory process. Alongside the media's tendency to flatten out cultural differences, there are also strong tendencies towards diversity and pluralization. This has occurred in a number of ways and for a variety of reasons. In the first place, as Barber argued, the rise of McWorld has been symbiotically linked to the emergence of countervailing forces, the most notable of which is militant Islam, or jihad. The second development is that the new media, and especially computerized printing techniques, satellite television, and the internet, have substantially reduced the cost of mass communication, as well as widened access to it. Think of the success of the Qatar-based television station Al Jazeera, launched in 1996, and providing a forum for the expression of non-Western views and opinions around the Arab world, and providing a rival to, for instance, CNN, Voice of America, and the BBC. Thirdly, cultural exchange facilitated through the mass media is by no means a top-down or one-way process. Instead, all societies, including economically and politically powerful ones, have become more varied and diverse as a result of this globalized cultural marketplace. In return for Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and MTV, developed states have increasingly been penetrated by Bollywood films, Chinese martial arts epics, world music like Putumayo over here, different movies that are made in different places, and different movies getting Oscars over traditional American movies, and non-Western religions and therapeutic practices like the practice of yoga or the practice of acupuncture. We now end off by looking at the last two sections in this theme of mass media and political communication, which refers to political communication itself and the politics of spin. Political communication is quite an important section for the exam, and this is a self-study section. If you look in Hayward, 3rd edition, you'll see the politics related to propaganda machines from page 241 to 243. You can use these slides as a basis for yourself, and make sure you study the media and propaganda. There are some examples of pictures to show what propaganda might be from various countries at various time periods over the years. Sometimes propaganda can be used in the interest of advancing a greater good in society, and sometimes propaganda can be used to advance greater evils in society through deceit and manipulation and untruths. This picture, for example, is a manufactured picture. It looks as if Donald Trump is taking or leaning on every word that Vladimir Putin might be saying as the leader of Russia, and everybody in this picture seems to be taking what he has to say as gospel truth. This was basically a faked picture. So these people were photoshopped in a specific way. But if you were just glancing at this picture, the different images you might perceive from it depend on how you interpret it. And one of the interpretations might simply be that everybody looks to Putin as the greatest leader on the planet. They all see him as somebody who has something worthwhile to say and who needs to be listened to. So we end off now with the politics of spin. In addition to political biases that operate in and through the mass media, growing concern has been expressed about this close relationship in modern politics between government and the media, and about how each uses the other for its own purposes. This has led to a transformation in the style and substance of political communication in democratic regimes, affecting both public opinion and, more widely, political culture. Governments of whatever complexion have always had an unreliable relationship with truth. Politicians are concerned primarily with winning and retaining power, and are thus ever sensitive to the need to maintain public support. The desire to accentuate the positive and conceal the negative is therefore irresistible. In especially liberal democratic contexts, and remember we've discussed what liberal democracy is in a few lectures back, the existence of free media rules out official propaganda and crude ideological manipulation, but governments have come to shape the news agenda by new techniques for the control and dissemination of information, often described as news management or political marketing. So this favorable presentation of information or policies, or what has come to be called spin, has thus become a major preoccupation of modern governments. Here you have this cartoon, once a spin doctor, always a spin doctor. You have a man standing out here with his hat held out, probably for begging for money. He says, ahead of a curve in global market trends. Okay, so it's just an example of the politics of spin. This movie, Wag the Dog, came out quite a few years ago, but it's still a relevant movie today with Dustin Hoffman and Robert De Niro, and you can watch the link for the movie here, or you can rent the movie, and it's really a very, very clever reflection of how a movie director helped to create spin and transform this American president, this fake American president's image, which was slowly going downhill. And what they did was use this diversionary theory of war to create and manufacture a false war out there and help unify the American people behind the president in fighting this false enemy out there. And in this movie, it's very clever. They used different songs that they created to try and unify the American people. They created a character with the name Shoe, and you have to see it. It's very interesting. The art of spin, practiced by so-called spin doctors, has many facets, and these include the careful vetting of information and arguments before release to the media, the control of sources of information to ensure that only an official line is presented. You can't have so many different options or different sources coming forward. You need an official line. The use of briefings or leaks that you can't attribute to anybody in particular. The feeding of stories only to sympathetic media sources. The release of information close to media deadlines to prevent checking or the identification of counter-arguments. And the release of bad news when other more important events dominate the news agenda. Okay, so we'll leave it there. Just so you know, the official definition of spin is the presentation of information so as to elicit a desired response, or what some people refer to as being economical with the truth. This ends theme 5 for the most important information you need to know for the exam. I will also be releasing, as the weeks come up now, an exam scope for my section online, which you must definitely have a look at, please, so you know which areas you need to study more in depth. Thanks very much for a fantastic term, and I hope you enjoy term 2 with Professor Victoria Graham.